All right. Are we are we ready to begin? Just so that everybody knows, Iona is going to record this. So if you don't want to be on camera, you can keep your camera off. I'm Jane. I work at Wild Goose Publications with my two colleagues that are here tonight, our very beloved boss, Sandra Kramer, who's here, and Iona, who is the queen of all things Zoom and keeps us all on track in many ways. Unfortunately, Neil, who would normally do the hosting, is not here tonight, so you'll have to put up with me. Um, I do a lot of different things at Wild Goose Publications, and one of the things that I do once in a wee while, not that often these days, is get to design books. And I wanted to start tonight about talking about this wonderful book that we're here to celebrate, which is called What Remains to Be Said by Yahia Lababidi. I'm going to get it right by the end of the night.
You got it.
Um,
You got it.
Thank you. I've been practicing for the last 2 minutes. Anyway, his very amazing collection of aphorisms, and can I just call it more simply in like my terms, it's a collection of wisdom, of things that are really universal. And we're here tonight to celebrate that book, and he's going to be in conversation with Alison Phipps, who many of you may know because she's a member of the Iona community, but I will give you both their official biographies in a moment. But I just wanted to say I designed this book, and I also designed the covers of Alison's two poetry books with us. And one of the things that makes the work from Alison and the work from Yahia really stand out in my experience of just the visual side of it was that it got me into this visual language of other cultures and how these different patterns and colours and ways of thinking and bust us out of where we often are, which is fairly landscape images and pastoral images of Iona. And so I want to say thanks to both of them because they opened my eyes, both of their books, in visual ways as well as the words. But tonight we're here to talk about the words. And the thing about what we do at Wild Goose is that you never know where words are going to land. You never know when you publish a book whether it's going to sell or not sell. But we do it anyway because we believe in what we do and we really believe in the power of words to change things. And what these two writers have in common is that they use their voices in just incredibly powerful ways about things that really matter, especially at this time and this place in the world. We'll get into that a little bit more in the conversation later on. But before I tell you a wee bit more about both of the authors, I wanted to read a wee poem that always strikes me as the reason that we do as book publishers what we do. And it's only 4 lines in case you're worried I'm about to go all kind of, Rabbie Burns on you. It's called Why Bother by Sean Thomas Doherty. And it says, why do you write? Why bother? Because right now there is someone out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. And I think that's what Yahia and Alison both do, is they fill those wounds with their words. So with no further ado, now I'll get into the official biography parts. So for those of you that don't know Yahia's work, it's decades of work that, he's been nominated for the Pushcart Prize 5 times. He's been translated into, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 languages. His work has been in the Best American Poetry and World Literature Today. He's been on Being with Krista Tippett. We're just incredibly privileged and lucky that Wild Goose is now also on his CV. And as for Alison, well, first of all, I'd tell you go to Alison's Wikipedia page because honestly, I couldn't even begin to give you the list of things that this woman's accomplished in her lifetime. I mean, it's unbelievable what Alison has fit into not enough years. The official line is that she's the University of Glasgow's holder of the UNESCO Chair on Refugee Integration through Education, Language and Arts. She's also been awarded the Minerva Medal of the Royal Philosophical Society. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and a Wild Goose Publications author, which clearly is a big part of her bio. But for us, she's written couple of really amazing books, going way back to Through the Woods, which was our first book of poetry with us. And then more recently, she did a very small PDF download called Call and No Response, which was a book of prayers in time of genocide, which is the common thread that brought these two writers together and to us at Iona Books. She also has a new book out at the moment, which I think you should all go and buy, which is called, wait till I find it. Alison, you can jump in here. I've written it out. Keep Telling of Gaza by Alison with Kaula Badwan, which is on CD Press, which is another book. She also wrote with Tawona Sitholé a really beautiful book called The Warriors Who Do Not Fight, which is a conversation in poetry, which leads me nicely to tonight's conversation, which is sort of a conversation in poetry too. So I am now going to hand it over to the writers, and after they've had a chance to talk to us about this beautiful book, you'll all have a chance to join in and give us questions. But for now, I'm going to give the floor to Alison and to Yahia.
Jane, thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction to our conversation tonight. And I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to meeting Yahia properly online. And also thank you for that lovely quotation you gave us to start with. A wound in the exact shape of your words is a little bit how I think Yahya and I came into conversation. And it was just after that little ebook, Call and No Response, had been published. And I had, of course, popped it on social media for people to know about and download. And the next thing I knew, Yahya was in my inbox saying, "This is amazing that there's a publisher brave enough to publish work that is directly addressing the genocidal condition inflicted on the Palestinians by the State of Israel and other allies of Israel at the moment, and also prepared to publish prayers and poetry around this." And introducing his own work, and I started to read it and thought, this is just amazing. Why have I not read this before? And then, to cut a long story short, put Yahya in touch with Sandra, and what we are celebrating tonight is the fruit of that ongoing conversation between Sandra and Yahya and Wild Goose Publications and Jane. And as usual, and I'll say this a couple of times tonight, the book is a work of beauty. As always, Wild Goose Publications have just surpassed anything approaching normal editorial standards with the way that they work, and just produce something that is absolutely beautiful. And the form, the visual form particularly, just really fits these aphorisms, these words of poetry. So tonight I'm going to enter into a conversation a little bit with Yahya around the subject, first of all, of aphorisms and prayer and poetry. And then we'll have a wee break, and people can pop questions in the chat or ask questions themselves if they want to. And then we'll have a wee look at Palestine, because I know this is something on many people's hearts that they wish to speak about. So I want to give that some space. And then again, we will move on after a little bit of question and answer to looking at the way that prayer and politics and action in the world and poetry might come together. So that should take us round about the next 45 minutes, I think. And I wondered, Yahya, if I might just start by reading one of your aphorisms to you and asking you to just meditate a little with us. And the one that I chose is, I think, one of your early ones and from early in the book. And it's this: "Those for whom the natural is extraordinary tend to find the extraordinary natural."
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And thank you, Wild Goose and Iona Community, for giving us this platform. That aphorism, I'm just traveling in time to revisit it, was probably written in my college days. So I want to say a good 25 years or so ago. And it was sort of the first stirrings of this sense of the numinous or the miraculous in every day. As a younger man, I did not come from a formally religious background. I grew up in Egypt, and we didn't go to pray, but we sort of were traditionally Muslim, in the sense that we observed what the larger culture observed. We were aware of the sacred, but I didn't really have names for these things, and certainly not as a 20-something-year-old. Just a 20-year-old was when I wrote that. And yet I was aware of something, another dimension that was here, that could be accessed here too. And I think that's what that aphorism sort of intimates, is this, that even here we have access to the miraculous. And if so, then when we do encounter anything of the other realm, then we shouldn't really be too surprised, because we're aware that exists out there. It's able to give us a lending hand when we need it.
I love the way that you've described that as a lending hand, but also your almost the way that you've been surprised by the numinous from those early college days, and without maybe with a cultural spirituality and faith that's rooted in the cultures of Islam, but which you were discovering yourself and was almost discovering you through the writing you were doing. And I wonder if you're able to go back to those early stirrings of writing yourself, and what it was like being found by writing.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it, because I don't take much credit. I like the idea of being found. And I think of an early line that marked me by Rumi, where he speaks of what you're seeking is also seeking you. And I thought that was such a great consolation, that we weren't alone in this search, that if we just took a few preliminary steps, we would be met halfway. And it was through poetry that I found my way to spirituality, and then faith properly. But it was this idea of the poets accessing this realm again, that was here and there at the same time. Even another early quote, because there's so many quotes ricocheting in my mind at all times, by Heidegger, because I was very taken by philosophy initially. And even, I admit, a rebellious, doubting philosophy, which did me no good, but it was a season of the soul that sort of pruned and readied oneself for flowering. And Heidegger talks about longing. He defines longing as the agony of the nearness of the distant. And again, that's sort of the extraordinary and the natural, and it's that same tension of the here and the there, both worlds at once. So really, I go from being someone who was culturally Muslim, as I said, but also a little bit rebellious and drawn to existential philosophy, to discovering mystic poetry, and particularly Sufi poetry, and sort of very gradually surrendering. And this, when I say very gradually, I mean it took me decades. It took this stubborn, rebellious spirit decades to fully surrender. And I don't think I fully surrendered now, but I'm getting there. And I do recognize poetry now as a way, as a form of prayer.
Yeah, I think that really gives us a bit of an insight into some of the influences on your work, particularly in those early days. So yes, cultural Islam. As I was reading through it, I was feeling as though Rumi was in the room with me and with you, and just sensing the glorious touch that Rumi's work brings to a world. I mean, there's something about the presence of Rumi's words, and also of many of the Sufi poets, that just feels like it's lighting things up where there might be a darkness, and that we didn't even know could be enhanced by light in the way that it does. And as I was reading your work, I had that same almost spiritual sense of ease and a gentle smile on my face
Oh, that's nice to
And
hear.
I
Thank
was
you.
then remembering one of Rumi's aphorisms where he
Mm,
says, whatever makes the corners of your
mm,
mouth turn upwards,
yeah.
trust that. And that was really for me in reading your work. I felt that.
Mm.
I love that you're a Heidegger fan too. I didn't know this, Yahya,
I
and I too. I mean, you know, the phrase in German, "Dichterisch wohnt der Mensch," poetically one dwells, will not leave me alone as a poet,
mm,
and I
mm,
sense that for you.
yeah.
Um, as you speak of it. But I was struck just to, I have a number of your aphorisms here that are just threading into the conversation, and you have one later in the book where you say, know your muse and its diet. And I
Mm,
wondered if you could maybe speak a little about your diet,
yeah.
the diet of your muse, if you like.
Yeah. Well, I think one discovers that through a lot of trial and error, and just figuring out what works over time. And I think it's different for all of us. I was reading this morning a quote that I return to that I'm fond of by Flaubert about how one should sort of be ordinary and dull in their day to day so that they can be violent and original in their writing. And for me, the diet that has worked thus far has been primarily a combination of silence and solitude. Um, I'm married, so it's harder to do both now, and my wife is very indulgent. But I do think that one has to kind of retreat, at the very least, into themselves to do a kind of deep self-diving in order just to overhear. And I think silence is essential, absolutely essential. I view it as a capital of riches from where all of this comes, all of this great wealth and insight and the voice of God, really. Um, Solitude is sort of initially how one finds their way into this by kind of creating a kind of circumstance where they're they're not available to the world and all of its din. And then, of course, once you do have something to say, you must make yourself available. I'm very aware of that now, and it's that balance between the inner and the outer, and recognizing that it's not just a form of self-indulgence; it's also service. So it's a diet I'm experimenting with, but I've learned the broad lines of it.
I can see your next book might be, you know, one of these blockbuster diet books called the Yahya diet.
I
And
also love to eat, and so I'm always, little tweaking every little thing and trying to figure out what's just right.
yeah, but I love how your aphorisms take you a step beyond yourself or beyond ourselves. So, you know, you've just answered that question about the diet of the muse
Mm,
being silence and solitude.
mm,
And I mean, I'm looking at some of the people on the call who I know are also poets who feed on that diet of silence
yeah.
and solitude. And coming to my mind was a line of one of Kathy Galloway's poems where she says, "I learned to love my solitude,"
Mm,
and that art of loving what is going to feed us, um, and knowing that that is one of the places where we need to dwell. But you also have another aphorism where you say it is possible to subsist entirely on a diet of honey and wine, also known as poetry and mysticism. And I wonder if you might just, you know, share a little about your understandings or your discoveries of the on the page about mysticism.
it's one of those subjects that I'm almost shy talking about publicly in person. I'm happier doing it on the page. Um, I think when we're worthy and true, we're found that way. We're permitted to speak on its behalf, if that doesn't sound too convoluted. Mysticism is I think vacating the self is a premise, is sort of is a beginning, a first step to being permitted any sort of mystical utterance. Um, I think of farming also, because I come from Colombia, and there's, we were on a farm, and so farming is another one of my new passions. And I think it's a matter of readying the soil. When it's constantly readying the soil. Again, it's not about taking credit for the great plant that chose to sort of erupt into flower on our soil. It's just the fact that we readied the soil, and the climate was just so that it was able to take root and grow under these circumstances. But it's always a surprise, and when it's always grateful, and this one at least senses they're not entirely worthy, and they have to try again and harder to be equal to that. Honey is poetry. There's a sweetness to poetry. It's something that when the world becomes bitter, I have to revisit in order to remind myself of that sweetness. And then the wine of mysticism is that kind of drunkenness that almost just pulls us right out and says, don't be deceived by these compelling illusions. There is another world, and it's constantly illumined despite whatever darkness we have to deal with here.
Mm. I sense in your words and in the aphorisms a studied commitment to something that you have found in the act of gratitude. And I wonder if some of what I feel we're reading is a mystical meditation on what it means to live with gratitude for the honey, for the wine, for the solitude, for nature, and whether of all the things which you wrap up often in your aphorisms as love, but whether at the root of that great word love, that word we use so rarely and so carefully and with such a deliberate withholding in poetry. It's too big a word almost for poems. Whether within it you found a mystical devotion to gratitude.
Again, Alison, that's beautiful. I think you're putting into words things that I'm sort of groping for in the dark sometimes. I do think at the heart of all despair, which is a word I do not permit myself, there is a crisis of love, whether we begin with the self, we move on to others, and then eventually the divine. So gratitude is this notion that one doesn't really deserve anything. Nothing is to be expected. And everything is in fact gifted. Every grace is a benediction in that regard. And I think once one sort of enters that territory, then there isn't room. There is room to complain about one's own imperfections, the world's imperfections, but not on a metaphysical level. So yes, gratitude is tremendous. And lately, and by lately I mean the last few years, I've made a concerted effort to keep a gratitude list, because one is forgetful, at least this one is. And so just by writing it down and revisiting it, I'm sort of reminded of my great good fortune, and that based on that, I'm not permitted to complain to myself or others for too long. So there's that.
I love the way in these conversations that I find myself in a lot with people from very different cultural or faith traditions, people who've been raised in languages that are a far distance from my own. There are certain things which seem to be places of deep meeting of the human spirit, the place of solitude, the place of gratitude, the place of being able to look one another in the eyes, and acknowledge the light in another, and the way in which many different wisdom traditions, be they in philosophy, be they in the deep wisdom in some forms of activism and political action, be they in poetry or be they in faith traditions, will strongly acknowledge the need for gratitude in all things. And within my own faith tradition, we have that, of course, of saying, you know, give thanks in all things. And it's a really hard thing to do at times, and particularly at a time when your people are on the receiving end of genocidal actions by Israel, and where you are writing of gratitude in a profound darkness, which must feel extremely lonely. And I wondered if, you know, if you have times with your gratitude lists where you really don't feel up to it, or you're stumbling, or you feel that gratitude doesn't flow, or whether it's become easier as a practice and as a mystical practice.
Again, these are very slippery things to talk about. Let me take a moment. Let me just take a moment. I'm someone who has accepted at this point that I don't understand and will not understand the mystery of things. Let me give you a quote, because again, this is my way into things. I remember being in a church in Argentina. My wife is Catholic, and we were visiting a church there. And I go with my notebook because I don't want to miss anything. And there was a line about el misterio necesita silencio y contemplación. The mystery requires silence and contemplation. And it really struck me, as simple and bare as it was. And so when I encounter things that, like what is happening in Palestine and what is happening in America, because there is now this agent of chaos, whom we call our president, who every day is sort of unraveling the world as we know it and decency as we understand it. Of course, there's that very sharp response, the emotional part, which is sort of faster than thought, and certainly much faster than the slow movement of the spirit, which may sort of flare up in anger or contempt, which is, again, not something I try to cultivate. But then I sit back and I think, yes, this is happening. We do all that we can, and I have to remind myself that God is also watching. So there's our part, and then there's the mystery part, which is unfathomable to me. And so to say that it's unfair or it's unjust, there's the human level, and then there's the metaphysical level, which is really unassailable. And I try to catch myself before I get too carried away when I think I'm being ungrateful in that regard. If that makes some sense to you.
That makes a lot of sense, and I love the care that you're taking to work around what is, you know, the slippery world of the poet in many ways. I know my dear friend Professor Kofi Anidaho, who is one of Africa's foremost poets, an extraordinary poet. If you haven't come across his work, you know, any of you do read some of Kofi's work. Kofi Anidaho, I'll put his name in the chat. But he says, poets, yes, you know, we think of ourselves as such beautiful creatures, but really we're just sticking our noses into other people's business. And those of us who are mystics are sticking our noses into God's business.
Oh dear. Oh dear. How dare we? Yes.
And I just love the mischief that he, you know, the way that he, as a great elder of African poetry, brings us all back down to earth with our mystical pretensions and our, you know, our careful wisdom, and brings in the playfulness. And I think that before I open it out to some questions, I wanted to just speak a little about playfulness, because you do talk through the aphorisms also about play. And play seems to be important. You know, you say, heaven saves us from tragic seriousness.
Yes.
Teach us to play divinely, or the play of ideas is eternal. And I just wondered if you might share a little bit of that mischief with us, that sense of playfulness.
I think that's huge, and thank you for pointing that out because that saves us really from so very much. It's a sense of proportion, as I understand play. This light and lightheartedness are not too far apart, and in
Mm.
many ways, I was thinking even of Thomas Merton as you were speaking earlier, whom I greatly admire, and he speaks about wars as being somehow, and I'm paraphrasing here, because we've taken ourselves too seriously, and if we had that divine sense of play and light and lightheartedness, how dare we? How dare we go there or even contemplate that? But I do think lightheartedness saves us and reminds us to be humble and reminds us also, um, that there is gratitude in smiling and in laughter, and there's this childlike sense of play which is connected deeply to creativity and even to holiness. I would go as far as saying so. Yes, play always. My goodness, even Nietzsche. I talked about existential philosophers who I lived with for far too long and too closely, but have mercifully escaped his clutches recently. Speaks always of this light feet and sense of play, and I think that's really, if we can cultivate that, even if we don't come from any particular tradition, even just a sense of play and lightheartedness will check us and prevent us from committing great crimes against humanity and the divine.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I know that within the Iona community, we are surrounded by elders and members who love to laugh and who have a glorious sense of the
Yes,
ridiculous, which
yes.
so often has has saved me when I am way too close to the edge of seriousness and far too close to being a bedfellow of Nietzsche. Um,
Hmm.
and I think I do think there's something very transformative as well in play and in laughter around play and in that experimentation that you have as a sort of almost like a silver thread running through your aphorisms. And the way that they've been so beautifully curated in this book of
Yeah,
aphorisms
yeah.
allows that to come through, the light and the shade and this silver thread through. But I can really see how that keeps a lightness to the work
I'm
throughout.
gonna I'm gonna jump in, Alison, and give credit to Sandra for the selection and the curation, because I couldn't have done this by myself. These aphorisms are over a 30-year period or so, beginning with when I was 19 through when I'm turned 51 months ago. And so for her to put them in such a manner so that they're in conversation with each other, because one revisits the same territory over decades and circles around trying to make sense of the same subjects. And I think what you speak of this balance of dark and light and sort of this through line, this is very as much her doing in curation and presentation as it is mine in conception, because I couldn't have done this. Is not what I submitted to them as a manuscript, but I'm so very pleased with what they've produced. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to mention that.
Yeah. Thank you, Yahya. I'm just going to see if anybody wants to ask any questions, either pop them in the chat, or if anybody wants to come on screen and ask a question at this point, or make a comment, or share their own wisdom. There's no compulsion to do that, but if anybody does want to, then do feel free to put your hand up or unmute yourself and ask a question, or pop it in the chat and I can call you in or invite you. Just keeping an eye across the screen.
We'd love to hear from you,
We
anything at
would.
all.
Anyway, I'm kind of looking at Jan and she's kind of almost nodding. and almost unmuting herself. And she's one of the people I was thinking about with this mischievous, playful sense of humor. Jan.
I'm not being mischievous and playful. I'm being very interested, but I would like to hear some more of the aphorisms. I because I haven't got the book, and I want the book to speak to me through you.
I'm happy to share. Thank you for your interest. I'm just going to open it, I guess, to any page and read from there for a few of them, maybe. Does that sound good?
Sounds perfect.
Okay. So I opened to page 111, and I'm not someone who is particularly into numerology, but I see those numbers all day long. So it makes sense to open to 111. And it says, and this is another beautiful thing that Sandra and Jane have done. I want to give them both credit for the presentation, is sometimes to just put one aphorism on a page. They have selected which one, and sometimes it's 3 on a page. This one gets a page of its own. Expecting large miracles prevents us from recognizing the countless small ones granted daily. Again, this is the notion of the extraordinary. Here's another one. If we do not care for our souls, we become a burden to others. If we do care for our souls, we make of our pain a gift for others. This is maybe one about difficult times, and that's all the introduction I'll give it. If we remain underwater long enough, we don't drown. We develop gills. Here's one about lightheartedness. To laugh out of sheer joy might be our most natural and holy state, innocent and wise. And unfortunately, I'll close with this one. I am living in America now. I'm also an American citizen. And so I have to contend with that. America, the hand that feeds you, then beats you. So that's a little bit overall tone.
I know, Yahia, that you've just given a tiny appetizer to Jan, and that she'll now be wanting a lot more, and the same for everybody else. Just really, just very rich, very simple, very thought-provoking, very meditative, and really a gift to hear them read in your voice as well. If anybody else wants to ask a question or make a comment, Lynn has just popped in the chat, and you might want to read this one. It's page 23, Yahia. She says, in these chaotic times, I'm particularly attracted to the aphorism on page 23.
Oh my goodness, yes. You know, you were talking about, thank you, Lynn, for pointing one out, because I much prefer to hear from other people what strikes them than to read the ones just on my own. You know, when Alison was speaking earlier of light and lightheartedness, I was actually thinking of its opposite, which is this kind of rigidity and narrow-heartedness, which we encounter, unfortunately, in the sphere of politics and also in religion. And so the one on 23, which you've prompted me to read, is Fanaticism is closer to doubt than faith. And I appreciate also how you framed it, because in these times of chaos, and I refer to the US president as an agent of chaos because I think he is, what consoles me is this sense, is this reminder of the indestructible realm. Yeah. And when one encounters that, then you think, oh, you know, these silly small players on the world stage now, they won't last long. They can't do too much damage, even though the damage is very real and one life is too much damage. But in the larger scheme of things, up against the indestructible world, it's a reminder that, you know, there is consolation to be had. As far as fanaticism, I might also mention, growing up in Egypt, I didn't necessarily encounter that in my circles, in my people I interacted with, but I was aware of a kind of dogmatic interpretation of faith, which turned me off of faith, which is why I took the existentialist philosophy route for far too long as a kind of rebellious reaction, because you'd have this very ostentatious, showy, loud faith that didn't correspond to a lived, a very quiet uh, interaction. You may have someone who will tell you, this is wrong and this is so and so and this is, and then you see how they conduct themselves and you think, well, wait a minute, how does that factor in to your the lived practice of it? So yes, fanaticism, as I understand it, in all forms, also politically, because we've got a lot of political fanaticism, is not to be trusted, and is an indication that this party or person is more lost than found.
Yeah, that's a very generous way of putting it, more lost
Yeah.
than found as well.
Well,
Um,
the alternative is to engage with them on their level, and then we're
exactly.
lost too.
We will lose our
Yeah,
voice and our poetry and our realm, the realm that you are writing of, the realm in which we might find a wider expanse of possibility for life. This brings me really to a moment for us to speak with you a little more about Palestine. And I want to just read your one aphorism in the book about Gaza, where you say, Gaza is a child with an amputated arm, still trying to make music. And I wonder if that might be what can take you into a reflection with us on what it means to write aphorisms through these genocidal times, to be a person of prayer, to be writing music yourself, even though your heart is amputated.
yeah. I mean, that was actually prompted by a photograph that I saw, which is very much what the aphorism describes, and I realized immediately upon seeing it that it was a metaphor. It was very much real, and it occurred very much to this particular person, child, unfortunately, but it was also a larger metaphor for a people, our people, meaning all our people, because there are no my people and your people, who happen to be enduring this great moral crisis, which we're all implicated in because we've established that there are no us and them, and yet, despite all of this, there is this resilience, this defiant hope, and the smiles, the joy, the innocence of life carrying on. But there's also music, and music, as I understand it, is many things. Music is gratitude, music is kindness, music is poetry. It's a culture very rich in art. Um, my aunt is a curator of art, a Palestinian curator who's in NYU and has really made it her career to put at the forefront Palestinian artists. And and it's just remarkable on a personal level, and it shouldn't be a stretch to imagine this because we all go through suffering on some scale or other. Just to imagine what it's like when we are deprived of basic things in life, meaning dignity, meaning freedom, meaning water, meaning the right to exist in our homes. And yet, despite all of this, to carry on with our backs straight, to be proud of where we come from, not to disown it or deny it or belittle it. And there's something really heroic about that. And it's heroic. It happens to be Palestinian, but that's the heroism of the human spirit.
Yeah.
That's what's indomitable about us. And if we recognize it as an us, what is great and noble, then perhaps we can also recognize as an us what is so very wrong, and throw ourselves in the mix, and make their lot our own. So this idea of Palestinians at this moment shouldn't be too hard to imagine for human beings. I don't know why it is, other than political interests or corruption, but I think there's good people everywhere. I know in Egypt growing up, it was very easy to distance ourselves from the government. It still is. So much so that, you could be in a coffee shop in Egypt, and whenever the president came on, our previous dictator, you would just turn the volume down because you knew everything that left their mouth would be unreliable. And yet the people and the government are separate. I know American people of good conscience. I know there's Israelis of good conscience. I know that certainly I've been very fortunate to encounter people in Scotland and Ireland and beyond. So the only borders, and I think there's an aphorism in the book perhaps about this, the only real borders are those of our compassion, not these artificial borders that we draw on the map.
Yeah. There's a line that we have in our daily liturgy that we say together in the Iona community, which is, there is a goodness at the heart of humanity planted more deeply than all that is wrong. And I think your words there really speak to that spirit as well. But I've also been minded, as you've been speaking, of that spirit and of a people made remarkable by circumstances that are unfathomably inhumane and cruel and barbaric, and enduring over decades and decades. Of Darwish's work, of Mahmoud Darwish, and it's obviously impossible ever to have a conversation with a Palestinian poet and not mention Darwish.
Yeah, no, he's tremendous.
So,
he really is tremendous.
And I was just wondering, to what extent he'd also been a kind of a set of echoes or fragments of his poetry have been in your mind as you've been writing.
Yeah. He means a great deal. He is someone who you mentioned earlier, Alison, in your larger framework, the notion of prayer and poetry. Darwish is really a beautiful example of that, because his poetry is a kind of prayer, and yet is very much engaged with the hard realities of the world. So it's always sort of just skirting beyond. I remember reading Under Siege in Egypt. So it has to be before I was 32. And just being blown away by that. Also being blown away by as a writer, because he was almost blaming the war for keeping him from his poetry. And the poetry wasn't an indulgence. The poetry was that indestructible realm, that realm of great, unassailable beauty that reminded us of how tremendous we are. We were streaming, light and goodness. And here was this small, petty, vengeful war, even war is the wrong word for it, constantly keeping him at this very low level. And he was recently, I read his book of his conversations. I don't have the actual name of the book. I should, because I read it fairly recently. It's Interlinked that published it. And anyone who's interested in Darwish, this book is a terrific sort of insight into the man with all of his complications and contradictions, because it's a series of interviews that he gives. And you really get a glimpse of how, in some ways, and I think of messiahs, this is my mind making associations, I don't know that he would agree with this, but I think of how messiahs are sort of initially reluctant, and then of course they have to accept the great good role they've been granted of service. And you do hear in Darwish's case, at least in in the interviews, the kind of human, we're talking about the ego versus the elevated higher self. You do hear the person almost resisting how even his love poems, and by love he meant another person, were always interpreted as patriotic, nationalistic, war poems, and he wanted to say that, I'm also a person who is a love poet, who has a personal life, and you're preventing me from the fullness, from realizing the fullness of myself with this kind of filter that you always impose upon my work. So yes, Darwish means a great deal. And since we're talking about this, and I received this book yesterday, I have to just put this up here. This has recently been published by Haymarket, I think is their name, who do tremendous work. And I've just begun it. But if you really want to know what it is like to be a Palestinian, this is an excellent behind the scenes look at it from someone who, because he's a poet, is able to say things that a journalist can't. I mean, even the prose is very lyrical, but there are so many registers in his voice, Muhammad al-Kurd, and it's really worth reading. It's not a demanding book. The subject naturally is demanding, but there are so many voices, and it's so well done that if I were to quote from you a paragraph, I would end up reading the whole thing.
And it's been a real, I think it's been a real gift and a blessing to many of us who work with poetry to have poetry volumes coming out from Palestinian authors. I'm just thinking about the posthumous collection by Rifat Alaria, who was a dear friend of mine, but also The Forest of Noise that has just come out, which is just exceptional.
Mus'hab is tremendous as a witness, as a daily witness. Yeah.
So there's just a real depth, and it's reminding me quite a lot of the poets that I read and learned much of, who were the poets of the Holocaust, and the poets of the French Resistance, and the poets of absurdism and surrealism in French and German, particularly the work of Bertolt Brecht, and a very similar sense in him to what Darwish also speaks of as this frustration. He has this poem where he basically says in German, look, the cherry tree is magnificent, but I can only write about Hitler. And that kind of that sense of I'm writing poetry about topics which are not poetic. And Darwish in Silence for Gaza, where he says, we do injustice to Gaza when we look for its poems, so let us not disfigure Gaza's beauty. And in that, just elevating into the realm of the mystical, the beauty, the contemplation, the vulnerable, that is at the moment this work that is ongoing, I think, in poets trying to do the poetic work with the least poetic of subjects or muses, which
very
is
well said.
The genocide. There's a question from Andrew in the chat, which I don't want to lose. Andrew, thank you. Andrew, do you want to ask it yourself? Do you want to unmute and just ask about this?
Good evening, Yahia.
Good evening, Andrew.
Hi, hello. My question is, please could you comment on the following aphorism from your book? We're here to pass around the ball of light while keeping our fingerprints off it, which I thought was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reminding me of that. I think the ball of light is what doesn't belong to us, is this great hope and joy and reminder again of the indestructible. And our fingerprints are all of these emotions, which are very human, all too human. I mentioned earlier rage and contempt and etc. And those are legitimate if channeled towards the light and service. But sometimes they can muddy what is luminous and beyond our reach. So the ball of light, as I understand it, for example, in my capacity, is this idea of reminding people of hope and trust. And those are very big words, and I recognize that it's difficult in times like these to speak of these subjects, but I would say that it's even more important not to lose trust in each other and not to lose trust in life. And the same applies to hope. And so if anything, our fingerprints would be our unexamined, unsorted emotions that might prevent us from passing on this light and lightheartedness which belongs to all of us.
I really love the way you're linking light and lightheartedness.
I think they're connected. I really
And
do.
and it's reminding me also of Lemon Sissy's work, where he's written a very short poem every day, and one of my favorites of his is where he says, "How do you do it?" said night. "How do you wake up and shine? I keep it quite simple," said light, "one day at a time."
Mhm.
And I was,
That's
whilst I was
good.
when I was reading your aphorisms, I was thinking I can really see myself coming back to these one at a time, you know, a steady, slow pace out of that frenetic rush that there is. And I think this links with what Delara, hi Delara, lovely to see you, has just popped in the chat. Delara is a visiting postdoctoral research fellow with the UNESCO chair who's in Glasgow for 9 months. So if any of you want a coffee with her and are in Glasgow, she's a fascinating person to talk to. But she's put a quote by Rumi in the chat that it's making her think of, which is, "God turns you from one feeling to another and teaches by means of opposites, so that you will have two wings to fly, not one."
That's great. That's great. This is a personal reference, but when I did leave Nietzsche behind, it wasn't too great a stretch to find Rumi, because both of them are very attuned to truth and paradox. And they're very good with saying, or not with saying, but rather with seeing how contradictions are not necessarily so. And there's truth. There's the great Niels Bohr quote about how the opposite of a small truth is obviously a falsehood, but the opposite of a great truth is another great truth.
Yeah.
And Rumi is very good with that, basically reminding us not to discard our pain, our suffering, all that comes with shadow, because there's light there too, if we know how to find it, and it will further us in our travels, in our flight, as he suggests, because we have wings.
And that brings also rather beautifully to mind the very famous Darwish quote about, you know, where will the birds fly after the last sky? But then the sense of the birds with two wings that is there in what Delara's just shared with us. I can see a few people are just starting to leave. Lynn has just said she must leave now, but before she does, she wants to thank you for the most worthwhile conversation, and
thank you, Lynn. Thank you for joining us.
And I want to thank you too for, you know, for reaching out that cold, dark, lonely day, I think about a year ago, with light, and, you know, the light that somebody brings and says, you're not on your own, you've been seen, you're witnessed.
Well, you were transmitting first. I saw your light. I saw your bat signal, and I thought, over there, I want to reach out to that person.
And of course, I was getting the bat signals from Sandra, based at HQ. So just want to thank you so much for your time tonight and for joining us in conversation. I certainly feel as though I could keep talking to you for several hours.
Likewise.
We need a crackling fire, and, you know, good mugs of tea, or some really great Egyptian coffee, and a chance to just talk poetry and philosophy and theology and mysticism, and to do so not just myself and yourself, but in this great company of poets that we're in the midst of right now, and the wisdom that's amongst us. But maybe just to finish by reading the last of your aphorisms, because it's about leave taking. And when I was reading it, it brought to mind the way we as a community in the Iona community say goodbye to people on Iona. And what we do is we put all our guests on a ferry, which we'll be usually on quite a choppy crossing because the weather is not great. And everybody's wearing Gore-Tex jackets and Wellington boots. I mean, we sometimes get sunshine, and they all line up and they give this
Wow.
great Mexican wave on the jetty to send everybody.
Really?
And it's this beautiful, playful moment of leave taking, and it comes after our service of leave taking, our service of farewell. As our guests leave us and the hosts stay behind, and in call and response we say goodbye to one another. And I was just transported to that service, and then that playful moment on the jetty when I read your last aphorism in this book of aphorisms, where you say, in life as in love, graceful leave taking is the epitome of gratitude. In life as in love, graceful leave-taking is the epitome of gratitude. In life as in love, graceful leave-taking is the epitome of gratitude. Yahia.
What a beautiful spirit you have. That's all I'm gonna say. Thank you for that wonderful image also of your particular experience of leave-taking, because yeah, nothing was expected. Nothing, life, love, company, people, all of this was a gift. And because it is a gift, how can we not but be grateful when we're eventually asked to give it all up and say goodbye?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. That was maybe one of our best author nights. I also could sit here till midnight. I want to pour out a glass of wine now and tell you, keep going, keep going, keep going. There's so much more I want to hear, but it's getting late. And I just really cannot thank you enough. Alison actually chose the one that I was going to finish on. So thank you for that, because it's such a beautiful way to end an evening. And I can also just say, like, what an unusual and kind of wonderful thing it is that we've got so many of our Wild Goose poets in one gathering. We have Jan here, we have Kathy here, we had Joy here. I mean, it makes me feel like what we do is important. Words do have power, and you are the people that are helping us put them out there in the world. So thank you, everybody. And now I have to find a way to repeat this in some other venue because it was so great. So I hope everyone buys this book, buys all of our books, because we want to publish more of these voices and get more things heard in the world. So thank you very, 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 very much, everybody.